Everyone, and welcome to this In Conversation event in conjunction with the exhibition The Governor General's Awards in Visual and Media Arts 2019. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event in conjunction with the exhibition, the Governor General's Awards in Visual and Media Arts.
I'm here at the National Gallery. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your patience. We're starting a little bit late. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the National Gallery of Canada resides on the ancestral unceded land of the Algonquin people, and to recognize that it is a privilege to gather here for this event this evening. I've been thinking lately about the land acknowledgements that I make here in my role at the National Gallery, and I want to say that they are important to me personally, apart from the fact that they're important to the gallery. Land acknowledgements have been for me a wake-up call, one among many, and I take them to be a step, maybe a small step, but a meaningful step on the path of reconciliation. I want to thank the simultaneous interpretation team for their work this evening. And I want to say also that this evening's conversation will take place, after this evening's conversation, we'll take some time for a period of questions and answers with you, the audience. This evening's event will take place in English, but questions during the Q&A period are welcome in both English and French. This evening, we're delighted to welcome to the stage two of the laureates honored in this year's Governor General's Awards in Visual and Media Arts, Leanne Martin and Jeff Thomas. Leanne Martin is an independent curator of Indigenous art. She's the former curator of contemporary Canadian Aboriginal art at the Canadian Museum of History and the former head curator of the Mackenzie Art Gallery. She was the Paul D. Fleck Fellow at the Banff Centre, where she coordinated the first Indigenous residency and an international symposium. She also served as the coordinator for the Task Force on Museums and First Peoples, and she was the First Peoples Equity Coordinator at the Canada Council for the Arts. Leanne has curated various projects that have been presented across Canada and toured abroad, including the 2018 National Billboard exhibition, Resilience, and the foundational 1992 exhibition at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, Indigena, Perspectives of Indigenous People on 500 Years. Her writing has been published by the National Gallery of Canada, Oxford University Press, University of Washington Press, Banff Centre Press, the National Museum of the American Indian, and Douglas and McIntyre. She now lives in Carp, Ontario. Jeff Thomas is a photo-based storyteller, writer, public speaker, and curator. He has works in major collections in Canada, the United States, and Europe. Jeff's solo shows include Birdman Rising, A Necessary Fiction, My Conversation with Edward S. Curtis and George Hunter, The Dancing Grounds, and Resistance is Not Futile. He has also been in many group shows, including The Family Camera, Toronto Tributes and Tributaries, 1971 to 1989, Landslide, Possible Futures, Sagahan, and Unmasking, Arthur Renwick, Adrian Stimson, and Jeff Thomas. He has received the Canada Council's Duke and Duchess of York Award in Photography, the Karsh Award in Photography, and a Reveal Indigenous Art Award, and he has been inducted in the Royal Canadian Academy of Art. An urban-based Iroquois, Jeff was born in Buffalo, New York, and now lives in Ottawa, Ontario. Now, I'm going to take a moment to make a shameless plug for something really great. Jeff is coming back to the National Gallery on Sunday, June 16th, from 1:30 to 4:30 to lead a photography workshop for Indigenous youth aged 12 to 24. So if you are Indigenous youth aged 12 to 24 or know someone who is, it is a free event. But registration is required. My colleague Larissa Voss is here in the room. She's raising her hand now. Larissa will make reservations for you. Larissa's in charge of that event. Jeff is going to discuss how to include content and narrative in photographic works. The participants will have the opportunity to apply these ideas in a guided photography session, and the workshop will end with an exclusive opportunity for youth to directly interact with one of Jeff's artworks. So at the end of tonight's event, Larissa will be here to take your information, and not to be missed. Now, tonight's conversation will be moderated by Greg Hill. Greg Hill, who is of Ganyangahaga, Mohawk, and French settler heritage, is currently the Audain Chair and Senior Curator of Indigenous Art here at the National Gallery of Canada, since his appointment in 2007. Greg began his career at the gallery in 2000 as curatorial assistant for Canadian Art to assist with the integration of Indigenous art in the Canadian historical galleries. When he was appointed as an assistant curator of contemporary art in 2002, he became the first Indigenous curator to be employed by the National Gallery of Canada. His tenure here has been dedicated to increasing both the collection and display of Indigenous art at the National Gallery. Greg has curated internationally touring retrospective exhibitions and written catalogs for some of Canada's most acclaimed artists, including Norval Morrisseau in 2006, the first solo exhibition for a First Nations artist at the National Gallery, Carl Beam in 2010, and most recently, Alex Janvier in 2016, as well as being the NGC's coordinating curator for solo exhibitions on Robert Davidson, Daphne Ojig, and Charles Edenshaw. In 2013, Greg was co-curator for Sagahan International Indigenous Art, the National Gallery's largest ever exhibition, and the only recurring global survey of contemporary Indigenous art in the world. Sagahan will be followed up this November with Abadakwene, Continuous Fire, Feu Continuel. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Leanne Martin, Jeff Thomas, and Greg Hill.
So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge this moment that we have three Audain Sony on the stage, which is, I don't think this has ever happened before here. I don't know. But it's great. I mean, Jeff being Onondaga from Six Nations, Buffalo, myself with my father from Six Nations, and Leanne Ganrikahaga from Tyndanaga. It's really, I think, an occasion, and one that I'm so pleased to be part of, because it's really about honoring the two of you, and on the occasion of being recipients of the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. Leanne, you're a lifetime of contribution, so it's amazing for me just to be able to play a small part in this and in honoring both of you. So thank you for all the work that you do that provides this opportunity. I wanted to say a little bit about how we know each other. So for Jeff, I think I've been in the Ottawa area for half of my life, 25 years now. I aged myself, and I met Jeff soon after I arrived here in '94, introduced by Ruth Phillips, and I was working on a thesis and about how the ideas of the Turo Wampum are actuated in contemporary life and in art. And so we had amazing talks and conversations back in those days, I think around '96. And Leanne, I mean, I mostly came to know you through the amazing work that you did with Canada Council, with the Equity Office there, at conferences, always someone who demonstrated professionalism and a high level of professionalism and generosity, I think, in terms of how you have done so much mentoring, but just like giving space and creating space for people and genuinely raising people up. And I think that's such a huge part of your work that needs to be recognized and acknowledged, so thanks. So I wanted to ask, both of you, I mean, have now, it's been decades of tireless work, maybe not tireless, but hard work. And I wonder, I mean, I'm looking at both of you, but I guess I'm looking at you more, Leanne. I wonder now, at this point in your career, like what when you look back is a highlight? Maybe there's more than one. We see we see behind us. We see a rotating screen of images that are some of those highlights. So you could speak to one of those, or something else.
I'd like to speak to something else, actually.
Yeah.
I think one of the highlights for me, very personally, was getting my master's in museum studies at the University of Toronto when I did. I graduated in 1989. And it followed a year of, the year before was the Spirit Sings in Calgary, which was the cultural exhibition for the 1988 Olympics in Calgary. And of course, there were enormously fraught issues around that exhibition. And I happened to be doing my master's during that period. And so all of these questions about representation, repatriation, and on and on and on were happening at that time. And I found a mentor myself in Tom Hill, who was later on the chair of the task force on museums and First Peoples, with whom I worked later. And so that, for me, that was an enormous first milestone. I was so happy, and I was the first person in my family to get a university education. That was also very personally rewarding to me and to my family. So, and that really propelled me into the career that I've had since then. And I could go on and on, a lot of the exhibitions, but I won't right now. That was my first huge milestone.
That's great. What about you, Jeff?
Well, I think the most important one was certainly this award. And the reason that I say that is because my career in the visual arts didn't start, it really began out of necessity. While recovering from a car accident in 1979, I had to find a way. I was only 24 years old, so I had to find a way to kind of find a new purpose in life. It was an interesting time because when that accident took place, I was preparing to move my family to the reserve and start a whole different life. And but that changed everything. And so I turned to my interest in photography. And what I had done is, when I was in the hospital, I made a vow that if I walk out of the hospital, I'll dedicate my life to making a contribution to my community. And having had my elders influence me during my early years, I made that vow to them that I would follow through, and that given a second chance on life, that this is what I would do. So from that point on, I set a very high bar for myself in terms of the vacancies that I found in photographic history and in contemporary photographic practice, with a notable absence of Indigenous people making imagery. So that was my goal, was to change the face of photography. And so I just kind of plowed ahead, and because I was self-taught, I had to learn as I went along. So each time that I finished one, I'd move on to the next. So there was never really any conscious thought about, is this a hallmark of my career or whatever? It was just like, you're still moving, so that's good. But it was at the Governor General's Awards when we had the ceremony, and they had asked us to prepare something to say, 200 words. And so when I started to speak, I kind of went off script, and I wanted to thank my son because he was there. And I realized that at that point that I had come full circle in terms of what I had set out to do almost 40 years previous to that. So I think in that sense, I felt like I was getting an idea of what people thought about what I did. And it was amazing because you never really think about those things as a worker. And when you see yourself as activist art in a way, and addressing issues that hadn't been addressed, especially about Indigenous urbanization, how far we've come from that period of time is just amazing. And so for me, that was a real hallmark in my career, to say that in a way I was released from the vow that I had made, and now I can move on to something else. So in my mind, that's how things began. I could, like Leanne said, you can go back and track moments when a photograph was made or something and it changed the way you see the world. I could give lots of examples of those, but I just think in terms of purpose and objectives, this is it.
Yeah, if I could continue on that, just to go back, when I was living in the state of Maine in the United States, and when I heard on CBC that there was going to be this exhibition, The Spirit Sings, and I guess this was 1986. And I was furious. There were no Aboriginal curators involved with the curatorial committee. And then as it went on, it was just, they were, ignoring contemporary realities and so on. And this just blew my mind, incensed me, and that was what drove me to university, because I thought there needs to be Indigenous representation, Indigenous voices in museums. And this was over 30 years ago, when it was really unheard of. Not until all the issues around the Spirit Sings surfaced when I was back here in Canada did it really become fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking a little bit about that earlier, and how there were so few curators. We can count them, on one hand, 1.5 hands maybe. And you stepped up. You did important shows, the task force report on museums. So thinking about 1992, which was such a watershed year for exhibitions in North America that were a critique of Columbus's arrival here, and you did Indigena with Gerald McMaster at the Museum of Civilization, and then you also did Close Encounters. The next 500 years, I mean, what's transpired between those? There's an 18-year difference between those two exhibitions. Like, what's your thinking on moving from 500 years? The kind of critique that Indigena was to the promise that Close Encounters was.
Well, if you can picture a time, as I said in my GG speech, if you picture a time when there were very few exhibitions of Indigenous art, very few programs of funding for Indigenous artists or curators, publications, there were very few, and so on. So it was a time for Indigena, it was a time to bring this history, 500 years history of colonialism into the fore, and hopefully have the settler community realize what our ancestors had been through for those 500 years. And it was really, to use a common term now, it was really a call to action, not only for the audience, but for museums, and to understand some of these issues. It was it was criticized heavily because it was very political. It was meant to be political, and it was meant to be in your face, and it was, and it looked at 500 years in the past. So we jump ahead to 2011 with Close Encounters, the next 500 years. By that time, in that short period of time, there's been so much that has happened, and I think we as co-curators of that exhibition didn't want any more to dwell on the past. We wanted to have artists come and envision the future through their writings and through their visual art and performances. So that was kind of, for us, that was a turning point in looking towards the future, hopeful or not, but yeah, it was. There was so much, I think, that had happened in that short period of time. It was amazing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you could probably trace a lot back to that show 10 years ago. So it's been 8 years of looking to the future, at least, right? And it's so much of contemporary dialogue now. For Indigenous artists and curators to think about that there is a future. But Jeff, you've been part of that as well in curating, but also through your artwork. And I think, for me, one of the strongest markers of time in your work is like your long, that passage of time that you become aware of in seeing your son bear in your work, and how that too is a kind of promise for the future. So I don't know if you want to comment on that body of work at all, or
Yeah, and I was living in Toronto in 1994, or 1984, sorry. And one of the things that was interesting about living in Toronto is that they were always talking about having one of the largest urban Indigenous populations in Canada and it was very hard to find Indigenous people outside of like down, in one section of Toronto. And I remember one day I had taken Bear to a comic book store on Queen Street, and when we were coming back across the street, I noticed that there was a wall that was tagged with Cultural Revolution. So I was going to photograph the wall as a part of my urban series, and then I just decided to pose Bear next to the wall just so he'd have a photograph of himself. And it ended up really pointing me in a new direction, because I had kind of been playing with the idea of street photography, documentary photography, and I realized that, as an Indigenous person, it wasn't going to work for me. There had to be another way of looking at the urban landscape. So what I realized from that image was that I had to become an interventionist at some level to find ways to intervene into the urban narrative with an Indigenous presence. And so it was kind of like from that point on that things began to shift in a new direction. And how do you make your presence known when there's virtually nothing around that has nothing to do with you culturally? And so 1992 became another pivotal year for me as well, because that's the first time that I came to Ottawa. I had made a trip across the United States that summer as a part of the Columbus events that were going on. I was interested in commemoration, and also too about I wanted to go to Columbus, Ohio, to see the Columbus ships that they had there, the replicas and that. And so it turned into a trip that went down south to St. Louis and then all the way across to Washington State and back across Canada. And when I returned, I was really dismayed, because I didn't shoot very much film, and I realized that it was kind of a journey of exploration in a sense. And it was the absences that I realized I could have made the trip all the way from Kingston back around and never see another Indigenous person. And that I could have if I wanted to, but the idea was, what does the landscape look like now, 500 years later, and where are all the Indigenous people? So that was the idea. And so from that point on, then in the fall, a friend of mine said, we have to go to Ottawa. You have to see the Champlain Monument with the Indian figure at the base of it. So we drove up. And of course, everything else was going on. There was Remembrance Day week. There were the exhibitions here and at the Museum of Civilization. And so it became kind of an important point for me in terms of looking at the Champlain Monument and realizing that, okay, so how do we intervene in this narrative? Is it possible to actually change the way that we look at public monuments? And so for me, that's when the process really began to look at Ottawa as a place of resource. And if that Indian Scot was to get up and leave, how would he manage the contemporary landscape? So I was intrigued by looking at a figure that was from the 16th century juxtaposed against the Ottawa landscape. Where would he go if he could leave this place? So I became his scout, and that's how the series began. And the photographs that you see here are part of that as well. So when the scout was removed in 1999, I used these Indian figures as a way to begin exploring where he would go and the world that he would navigate. So it was really out of that these were representative of him, and how do we locate ourselves in this landscape? And then the reverse of that, of course, was how do non-Indigenous people look at stereotypes? How do they look at the landscape about remembrance of Indigenous people that were here? And so this is how all of this began to unfold in terms of finding those markers and working with them and addressing invisibility, which is essentially what it's been about.
And that kind of being visible, I mean, through your work, it's been, there's a strong personal narrative that runs through it, but it's also expanded in scope to be inclusive. Like I'm thinking of how one could work from a strictly Haudenosaunee perspective, but what you've done is opened it up broader, and I think that relates a lot to the work that you do, Leanne, in your curatorial work, and certainly that I do in my position here, where we're thinking in terms of Indigenous and global Indigenous, but and to me that's why it's important that there's three of us here, Haudenosaunee people, on stage together, and I wonder if you've thought about that in your, what opportunities have you had to really like work with those ideas, or how do they figure in your curatorial work?
Not a whole lot, Greg, for me. And it's interesting because, thinking about, a lot of the changes from when I began and exhibitions I curated then and sort of now, I see not so much for me, but with artists, back then, it was very, artwork tended to come from a very generalist perspective, looking at more inclusive Indigenous perspectives rather than their own specific cultural perspectives, perhaps. Not everyone, but the majority of artists with whom I worked, I think that was sort of a hallmark of the time, was we weren't so much bringing forward our own sort of cultural perspectives. It was more sort of a fight, a stance for Indigenous peoples in general. And I think that also has been something that has been a key in my curatorial practice, say working with artists who then want to bring their own specific cultural perspectives, issues, concerns forward. But in my practice as a curator, no, I don't bring that forward from my Mohawk perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not that I don't want to, I just haven't.
There's still time.
There's still time.
But I don't know what that would look like.
I don't either.
So that
Yeah.
would be interesting. But I do know what it looks like in your work, Jeff. And you've said interesting things to me, like in our interview. This, how you carry your Haudenosaunee identity with you in an urban space, and I was talking to you about that. What you had told me at the time about seeing yourself in the canoe that is part of the metaphor of the Turo Wampum, the Goswanta Turo Wampum belt. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, and I don't know if do you have thoughts on the difference between having to communicate with an audience in a more general way, and then having those opportunities to be really, really culturally specific, and how that can work?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. I think right from the start, it's always been a balance. When I was growing up, I think that the way that my background came into play in my practice was what I learned from my elders when I was growing up. So when I would go to the reserve with my grandmother, I would have all these questions. So I was a young teenager, and so we'd have these very interesting conversations, and they were traditional longhouse people. And but what I found that was interesting about my experience with them is that it wasn't so much about, like when we think about tradition and culture and that, and we think about ceremonies and dance and that, what I was intrigued with was the everyday life, was how they lived their lives every day based on those traditions that they grew up with. The philosophy of being Haudenosaunee, and then how did that manifest itself in me? And I always thought that maybe I'd live on a reserve and I'd be doing other things. But what I realized is they were preparing me to go out into the hinterland and to find my own answers. They never lived in a city, so they couldn't answer the questions that I had. But what they did is they prepared me philosophically for that journey. And so that's, for me, that's how it began to emerge. But I also, like my great aunt Emily General, had also been an activist. And so people that would come by the farm to visit were non-Indigenous as well. So right from the start, my grandfather would go into Caledonia, and we'd go into the horse racing place they had there and sit in the stables, and he was talking to old-timers who were non-Indigenous. So I saw both of those areas. So, they were living the idea of the Turo Wampum Belt. So, of course, Emily once said to me, she said, "Don't ever forget where you come from." And what I began to understand about that more recently was that she was actually saying, "Don't forget what we've taught you." And so I can say that what they taught me has been a part of my practice right from the start. When Greg had the show Sakahan here, I had an opportunity to make portraits up on the Champlain Monument on the platform. So we had 4 different photo shoots. Anybody could come up and pose. And it was really interesting because I had a selection of people from around the world, and also Indigenous people from around here as well, and other parts of the world, all on the same platform. And a lot of the people didn't know what used to be on that platform. And I remember I was telling one guy that came over, and he said, "My family and I would like to pose." And he said, "Can I go find them and bring them back?" And so he eventually came back, and he had like 7 kids. And we got them all, almost all of them on the platform, and made a really nice portrait of them. And so he began to tell them the story that I told him about the project. And then he took his family across the street to where the Indian Scout is now, and then told them about that. And then he wrote to me and sent me a text that talked about that experience. And I thought that is just as important as the other things that I'm doing as well within our own community, because how do we create a better world for our children? And at some point we have to learn how to coexist. And how do we get the non-Indigenous people into that conversation? And so that's always been a part of my work, and I've always tried to make it inclusive as well.
Leanne, I wanted to ask you about one of the slides that we're cycling through, and it's the image of you and Bob Boyer at the Mackenzie Gallery for the opening of the Powwow in Art History. And you're both wearing outfits that are quite specific and particular to the exhibition. It'll be the next slide if we can pause on the next one, I think. No, it's not the next one. We'll wait for it to come up. So, do you want to talk about what was going on there in that slide?
Yeah, I'd like to wait till the slide comes up because.
Yeah, so it's not this one. It should be soon.
No, keep
Not
going.
this one.
Nope.
Okay. And one more.
There.
Thank you.
Yes, this exhibition was the Powwow in Art History, and it was at the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina in September 2000, as you can see on the slide. The painting that was included in the exhibition, it was a signature piece for the exhibition. It was a painting by the late Harry Fonseca, who was a Maidu artist from California. And he was known for his hilarious images of Coyote doing all sorts of crazy things, Coyote being a leather-clad biker, Coyote going with Rose in this one to the Powwow Cafe in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was just such a wonderful, wonderful contemporary, hilarious image that Bob and I both loved. So, and we knew Harry, and we wanted to pay an homage to Harry as well as have some fun. And so we decided we were going to dress as as Coyote and Rose for the opening. And so I was saying to Greg and Jeff earlier that there's a whole story about how we found the fabric and the patterns and made the outfits. And and Bob Boyer taking me to a ballet store a dance store in Regina to buy the fishnet stockings to go with my dress, and his partner Anne making the suit, which I now have. She bequeathed it to me after Bob's death, so Coyote and Rose are still together in my closet, and we. At the opening, before we did the usual speeches, we did a little dance, sort of similar to that in Harry Fonseca's painting, and it was just fun, and it also it really cemented Bob's and my relationship as well. We'd been friends for a long, long time, and this was the first time that we were able to work on this exhibition. And it was wonderful because we wanted to do the powwow, both of us. I had just recently moved to Regina to be head curator at the Mackenzie Art Gallery, and we wanted to do an exhibition on the art history of the powwow. It wasn't a cultural history, it was an art history. We looked at paintings and photography from the early 19th century to present, to the 20th century, and and beyond, 21st century, and looked at the early painters from Oklahoma, the Kiowa Five. Anyway, we went all through the plains. Bob was an expert in historical art, and I had the expertise in contemporary art. So it was a wonderful, wonderful working relationship, and and it was also an homage to our late friend and colleague Harry Fonseca. And it came to, the exhibition came to the Museum of Civilization after that, yeah.
You know, I can add something to that.
Yeah.
Because I was there for that opening. And I remember that I was so kind of nervous and kind of didn't know a lot of people in that, but I enjoyed the moment. It was a lot of interesting intrigue. But what I wanted to say was that one of the first documentary projects I did was on the powwow dancer, and it started officially in 1982. And so, you know, I began with this idea that the powwow represented something that was far more important than just kind of like the competition and the different things that go on, the colorful dancers and things like that, so it was black and white. But there was something about resilience that I found that was so important about the powwow, and that's what kept me working with it over the years. And I remember that when Leanne invited me to be in the exhibition, and I was thinking, you know, Greg was mentioning earlier about what it was like back in the 70s and 80s, and we had very few curators in that. And here was the first time that I was included in an exhibition on the powwow that really had meaning for me. And also looked not only at, like Leanne was saying, as an art history, brought another element to it that was badly needed. So it was a very important conversation that was taking place about the powwow at that period of time. When it came to the Canadian Museum of Civilization, I took my in-laws over and gave them a tour of the show. And it was amazing because I could go through the whole exhibition and tell them everything about it without having seen the catalog. And so in my mind, that's what indigeneity in the gallery means, is that when you can do something like that, then you know it's working. And so, of course, you know, I'm still pursuing my powwow work in another way, but I think that just in terms of our connection, in that, and how important that exhibition was for me in terms of my own work, because all of a sudden there was this interesting, important conversation that was taking place.
That's good to hear.
Thank you, Leanne.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was at the opening at the Canadian Museum of Civilization when you donned the same outfits with Bob and gave talk there, and for me, that was when I was still studying to be an artist, not to be a curator. And for me, it was a moment to realize that there's different ways of being curators, and there's different important ways to create exhibitions and subjects of exhibitions, like the powwow. So it was an important moment for me as well. And I'm wondering, I mean, just on the idea of curatorship, Jeff, because I know you're kind of pulled back from the idea of being a curator and focusing on your work, but you too did significant exhibitions, and I wonder why you did that, you did those exhibitions at those times?
Well, the first exhibition I did was at National Archives, which is what it was called back then. And I was invited by archivist Edward Tompkins to co-curate an exhibition that surveyed the breadth of their collection from the first daguerreotype in the collection from 1846 up into more contemporary times, with including work like Shelley Nero but that it came out of necessity because nobody else was working with historical photographs. And my passion was equally geared towards historical and contemporary. So I think just my background in terms of looking and studying the work of Edward Curtis kind of led up to looking at the collection. And that was a significant moment for me. So I kind of fell into it, just by invitation. I had no experience at all. And then 2 years later, Gerald McMaster was at the Canadian Museum of Civilization and invited me to come over and to curate an exhibition on their anthropological collection from the Geological Survey of Canada. And so that was another opportunity for me to look at a significant collection and to bring it out into the public domain. Photographs that were, in my mind, that had been undervalued in photographic history in terms of the quality of the imagery. And so during the curatorial process, I realized that these photographs were the first time that they were being exhibited. They were mostly in cold storage, and no prints had been made from them. So this was the first time that we took the glass plate negatives to a printer and had new prints made from them. So those were like the first prints. And so I realized that I didn't want it to be kind of like this gaze at Indigenous people from the past. I wanted it to be kind of a community awakening. So I changed course and I invited 6 artists to be in the exhibition, including Greg as well. And so I wanted people to, so one half was historical, one half was contemporary. And the idea was to show the relationship between the two, and that this was a community. And I thought it was effective. But my work as a curator really kind of paralleled my work as an interventionist. So different institutions would call George Eastman House or the Glenbow or someplace would say, Jeff, we're having this exhibition here in Switzerland and on Edward Curtis, so we want you to come in and do a counter to it. So that was I wouldn't really consider myself a curator in that sense. I'm kind of like an artist who likes to work with collections. I guess that's a curator. So I'll proudly wear it. But in any event, it was more of something that was of necessity. Nobody else was looking at collections the way that I thought they should be looked at, so I decided to do it myself. Mm-hmm. That's how it worked out.
I'm kind of having a moment as you talk in realizing that you might have instilled a very important idea in me, and that would be making the connection between contemporary practice and historical objects or images in this case. But the idea, because with Emergence, you also did a lot of work in activating those photographs by bringing them to community, and that kind of led to project naming and things like that, so making meaning and significance out of the photographs themselves and the people portrayed in them, and then attaching that to what artists are doing today. So I think that's a really big thing. Leanne, I wanted to, maybe we can go to, see if we can we go click through the slides until we get to the Alex Janvier? That's it. Okay. Leanne, I wanted to ask, in thinking about this long span on time, and I think Alex Janvier is a good example, having a 65-plus year career, and your long time working with him and doing that important exhibition's first 30 years, which again was like forward-looking, looking back, but looking forward. But this project, this is Alex Janvier's masterpiece work. that you can see across the river if you have never had the benefit of going over there, and now you can lie down in the what do you call it, an extended couch and gaze up at the work, and there's a whole website in support of it.
Yeah.
And do you want to tell us a little bit
Yeah,
about it?
yeah. That, and I talk about being in the right place at the right time with this, because it was 1993, right? And I was replacing Gerald McMaster at the museum. Gerald had taken an educational leave for a couple of years, so I was interim curator of contemporary art there for 2 years. And during that time, it was decided that there had been successful fundraising, and it was time for Alex to paint the dome. Now, there had been a discussion amongst George MacDonald and Douglas Cardinal and Alex at the opening of the museum in '89 that Alex should consider painting the dome, but of course they had to raise the money for it. So while I was there, they got the money, and so I was the sort of commissioning curator, and was involved with all of the details with Alex going up. There was a scaffold that was built. If you go to the museum, there's a scaffolding outside. It's in the shape of a geodesic dome, and they now have programs and picnic tables and stuff under this dome. But that scaffolding was created for Alex and his son Dean to paint this dome. And I spent a wonderful 4 months with Alex, just in the evenings talking about how he was going to change his design and what he was going to do, and talking about the challenges of the dome shape and how that would affect his design, and then of course the symbolism of it. And I'd climb up there every day and spend a good part of every day up there with him. Bought him happy knees, so he was happy, sort of, kneeling around on the scaffolding. And so that for me was one of the most memorable of my times as a curator. And getting to know Alex, I took him to meet my mother and my sister. We spent a weekend together with them. We went down to Six Nations. At that time, his show that I had curated, his first 30 years, was at the Woodland Cultural Center at Six Nations. So we went on a road trip down there, and he gave an impromptu tour to all of the people there, and they loved it. And he was just, so warm and generous, hilarious. All of the staff at the museum for the 4 months, 4 months, 4 months that he spent there, the staff just fell in love with him, and when I worked at the museum and left a few years ago, he came to visit because we were working on the website for the Morning Star, and staff members still remembered him, and he remembered some of them. Not their names, but he remembered them. So it was very fulfilling. One of my last duties at the museum was to work on the website and get those wonderful chairs so that people could really sit back and enjoy it and dive right into it. And I must say, during so many stressful times that I had at the museum, 1 or 2, I'd go down there. It was before the chairs were there, but I'd still just go down there and immerse myself and my mind into that work.
Yeah.
It's titled Morning Star. Yeah.
I'm so grateful too for your contribution to the Alex Janvier catalog for the show here, and unfortunately we couldn't bring that work over here. We brought it in video form, but it's interesting because all of us have had this interrelationship between the gallery and the museum, and I wonder, through exhibitions, through work, Jeff, you've been here, I wonder what you think about this relationship, because what differentiates now the museum from the gallery? This is just a small question to finish up on. Or should there be a difference, or is there a difference, or?
There is a big difference right
Yeah.
now at this moment between
Okay.
that institution and this, yes.
Okay, so we won't go into that. But what do you think, Jeff?
Well, what I would say is that when we look at the length of our careers and the things that have transpired and how much inclusivity there is now on a lot of different levels, we've achieved a lot. And but I think that there's still something when we look at these institutions. And for me as an artist, what I want to be able to do is to ensure that our own communities have access to these exhibitions as well. And of course, there's stigmas that are in place. There's a history of not going to museums or galleries, and there's a real need for the youth in our communities to have something to look up to and to aspire to. And in my mind, the institutions are an important player in that project, but in terms of us as the image makers, the curators, the writers, how do we ensure that our communities are benefiting from what we're pursuing as well? In my mind, that is one of the things that I learned early on from my step-grandfather when he was braiding corn, is that the three strands represented the past, the future, or the past, the present, and the future. And so we have to also think about what we're doing now. How will it reach out into our communities and inspire youth in our communities as well? So in my mind, that's how I look at the institutions, is that it's a place to work from, but how do we use new technology now to make it more accessible to other people as well?
And if I could, I don't see it being either this institution or that institution. I see it both, and I think there's room. There are so many spaces. If artists and curators want to, pursue projects at the museum, then great, wonderful. It's a different perspective, different context, and that's one of the things I see now that is so different from way back when I started. Is that there are so many more spaces for artists now, today in Canada. So it's really, it's very gratifying.
And so important that both of you have been such a big part of it. So I think at this time, we have a few more minutes to open it up so we can include all of you who made it through the traffic or however you got here, to ask a few questions. So there's mics on either side, and feel free.
Good evening. I want to thank all three of you for a very generous and inspiring talk, and to add my appreciation for that. Greg, you referenced a couple of times a wampum belt, and I'm not familiar with it, and I wonder if you could explain to me a little bit more about it. I think there was mention of how it connected to coexistence and sort of almost predicting or imagining the contemporary situation. And so I'm very curious to know about that, and I didn't quite catch its title, so I'd like to know where it is and as much as you can tell me, please, about it.
Yeah, you can find a lot of information about it just searching two-row wampum in Google. But basically, a wampum belt is a belt made out of carved shell beads, and they are documents of agreements or mnemonic devices to relate things. In this case, it's a long white belt with a white belt with two purple lines on it that run parallel. And it's a metaphor for two vessels traveling down a symbolic river. and because those lines are parallel, they never cross. They're the beads that between them, the 3 rows of beads between them that maintain that space between them are also a compact, a relationship. So it's about maintaining that relationship, not one canoe or vessel traveling down that river, getting too far ahead of the other, and always respecting each other's life ways and customs. But there's still a separation in recognition that this metaphor is specific to people coming from Europe and Haudenosaunee people, Ongwehongwe people, Indigenous people in North America, traveling together and living together. So it's kind of like a model for cohabitation.
When was it created?
It was created in the. What's documented is that it was first created in exchange between the Ganetgahaga, the Mohawk, and the Dutch in the early 1600s, and then it continues to be very salient, prominent in the work of artists today, I would say.
The date, what was interesting with Sakahan is that was the 400th anniversary of the Tura Wampum Belt. And at that year, there was a delegation of Haudenosaunee people that went to the United Nations in New York City as a part of Remembrance of the importance of that belt. Mm-hmm. And it was also the 400th anniversary of Champlain arriving in this area as well. Mm-hmm. So it was a significant kind of convergence of this ideal of coexistence and then what was actually transpiring with Champlain as the instigator. And I think that more than anything else, it shows us how to live in a certain way. And now, of course, those rivers have crossed. In my mind, the document still exists, and it also was recognized as the first treaty in North America as well. So it has a lot of significance in that sense. And in the metaphor of coexistence is how do we get along with one another, which is really the substance, and respect one another as well. Indians have always maintained that, Indigenous people have always maintained that integrity of the original in that sense. It's just that somehow or another it got a little corrupted on the other side of the river,
And where is this document held as artifacts?
well, originally it was in the New York State Archives in Albany, New York. And some of those belts have been repatriated. I don't know if the Tura Wampum has or not, but some of them have been. But that's where originally was kept.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk today. This question is actually for all 3 of you. Who did you look to, or who do you look to for guidance professionally within each of your career trajectories? And I ask because I'm incredibly aware that I've looked to all 3 of you for guidance in mine. So it would be great to hear who you looked to at the time when you were starting out, or continue to look to for guidance as you work in your fields now.
Well, Rochelle, I'm looking at you every day. Yeah, I mean, in seriousness, I mean, we're Rochelle, for those of you that don't know, is working with me as co-curator on Abadakwane, which is our new, the second iteration of Sagahan coming up this fall, and I do have to look to Rochelle for guidance every day. But I think my guidance has been a lot of the publications that have been created, by Leanne, by others. My first, I think what set me on a path of wanting to focus on Indigenous art as an artist was my first experience with a text, and that was Norval Morrisseau, The Art of Norval Morrisseau. So the big 1979 Methuen publication. So I was inspired by an artist, the document created that was left behind, the realization that an Indigenous artist could do this, could have something like this, was kind of a revelation for me, and then it kept on going and opened up to a whole world of becoming aware of the work that was done by everybody else.
I answer briefly. When I first began, like in the mid-'80s, I was living in Maine, and I had a great support system there of Indigenous people. There were a number of elders who were Penobscot, and they didn't take to me too well in the beginning because the Wabanaki Alliance and Mohawk Nation didn't like each other a whole lot, without going into the history. They've just been, in recent years, they've signed a peace treaty. So, but it was the number of elders on Indian Island, the Penobscot Reservation, who were so helpful to me, and my impatience, and just guiding me, pointing me in the right direction, not giving me the answers, but showing me where I could go. There was an elderly Indigenous advisor at the University of Maine, where I was at the time, and he also was important to me. And then, and there have been very many people, but the one constant person in my entire practice has been my friend and colleague in New Mexico, Margaret Archuleta, who is a former curator. She's working on her PhD now for years and years, but she and I talk, consult, cry, advise, and she is my go-to. She's San Juan Pueblo. All the issues in the States we talked about with curators not being there and artists, and anyway, she just helps me a lot for so many things.
Well, as I had mentioned in the beginning, like Leanne just mentioned, the role of our elders and my family elders who guided me. But in terms of imagery, Edward S. Curtis was probably the most influential person in my career. And a lot of people kind of shocked when I say that, because they think, here's this guy who went out and made these stereotypical photographs of Indians in the early 20th century and blah, blah, blah. So there was a lot of it was problematic, his work, but I like the challenge. And what I realized is that what he did for me was point me in the opposite direction. So if this is what he was doing, and this is what he was comfortable with, okay, so how do I feel about that? Do I want to go out and photograph other Indians, or do I want people to understand how an Indigenous person sees the world around him? So there was that kind of conflict with Edward Curtis that and I really wanted to take it to task to say that, there's other ways of looking at this imagery as well. When I looked at the people in his photographs, they reminded me of my elders. So there was something there to work with, but I had to find what it was on my own. And that's why I moved to Ottawa, was to study the complete 20 volumes at Library and Archives Canada. And it was at that point that I began to understand that Curtis wasn't the problem. It was the way that his work was marketed to the public. It was marketed to a non-Indigenous audience. So how would that change if it was being directed towards an Indigenous audience? And for me, that was a challenge. And so I used him as kind of like my focal point, much as I used the Champlain Monument in the same way as well. But it was that. And it was just taking what I had learned, the idea of respect and how we approach our subjects and things like that, and what is the intent? What is it that you want to say? And that's what all kind of emerged for me from my elders and how it was applied to what I eventually did in working and kind of deconstructing the historical photograph in the beginning.
I think we're running out of time, but
One
do
more.
we have time for one more question? Sure. Go for it.
Hi, Leah and I used to work with you, and one of my favorite things about working with you was you're helping me understand what contemporary Indigenous art meant, because I'd walk into a room and go, what is that? And you took care of that a lot. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the Rebecca Belmore piece that's shown in the slideshow here, just so give an example of the kind of way you go about explaining that stuff.
Thanks, Jameson. I miss working with you. Okay. We need to find the piece. The Rebecca Belmore piece that Jameson was talking about is called Trace, and it was a work, it was in situ work at the Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. And Rebecca and I put in a proposal for it. It was a competition, curators and artists, and we were fortunate enough to be chosen.
stop
There
here?
it is, yeah. So Rebecca's idea, and I'm going to be very quick here. We're gaining time.
Yes, it's time.
So the Museum for Human Rights was based, when it was being built, when it was under construction, it was, there was, of course, a lot of excavation, and it was found that there were a lot of human remains and other artifacts underneath the place where the building was going to be put. So there was a huge consultation with local Indigenous leaders on what should be done, and it was decided that the objects and the human remains would be returned to the land where they had originally been. So they were reburied, but relocated underneath the museum itself. And there were ceremonies and other discussions that had happened before this was decided. It was a long process. So Rebecca, in doing her research for this work, decided that she was going to acknowledge that presence of the thousands of people who had gone before her in that space, she not being from that area herself. So she made this, it's kind of sort of like a big cape. And I don't know how, I honestly don't know the dimensions now. I want to say 60 feet tall.
Really big.
Yeah, is it?
It's really big.
It's really, really big. And
Each one of those
yeah.
things that looks like a bead is
It's a hand.
Is a fist.
So what she did, she worked with some people in the city of Winnipeg, and they were excavating around the city doing various construction works, and they dug up all the clay, the gumbo that it's known for in Winnipeg, and they dug it up and brought it to Rebecca's studio, and she and her assistants would sort it out, clean it up, and bring it in these huge sort of cylinders. And then on the image to the left, she had a public workshop for, I want to say, about a month, and invited people from all across Winnipeg or wherever, if they were visiting, to come and make these hand-pressed beads. So they're all the size of, how does it show here? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So she, I guess, am I back?
Oh, you're back.
So people came in and took a hunk of this clay, the gumbo, and shaped it so that it would show the inside of their palms, all the veins and the lines in their, not the veins, but the lines in the palms of their hands. And she had thousands, I think she said she had 12,000 of these made by the people of Winnipeg. And then they were fired. She and her assistants went out to Banff and fired it. And she wanted the Cape sort of effect, so that it was like this cloak of inclusiveness and warmth developed from all of the hands of actually very many children, because she wanted, there we go again with the future and the hope. She wanted a lot of the young people in the city, and especially this, where she was making it was in the north end of Winnipeg, where there are huge racial tensions. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what she did. And it was, she drilled a hole in the ends and strung them all together, and they're on like a carapace, and suspended from the ceiling in the Museum for Human Rights. And it's about trace, and it's about the future and togetherness and respect and all of those things. And that, in a nutshell, is what it's about.
Well, thank you both, Nyawat Goa. I think that will conclude our talk, and I just thank you so much for sharing your generosity, all of your hard work, and thank you to audience for your attention and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I also want to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their generous support of the event this evening. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Greg. Don't forget, if you are or know 12 to 24-year-old Indigenous youth who would like to participate in Jeff's photo workshop, Larissa is right here. That's Sunday afternoon. Thank you, everyone. The exhibition carries on until the 5th of August. Thank you.